Topsy-Turvy by Jules Verne. Translated by Anonymous. Chapter 15, which contains a few interesting details for the inhabitants of the earthly sphere. Finally, the government of Washington had found out the place where Barbicane & Co. were operating. Should they doubt the authenticity of this cable? No, that was not reasonable. The consul at Zanzibar was a very reliable person, and his information could be accepted without doubt. It was further corroborated by later telegrams. It was really in the center of the region of Kilimanjaro in the African Wamasai, a little under the equatorial line where the engineers of the NPPA were going to accomplish their gigantic works. How could they have secretly reached this lost country at the foot of the celebrated mountain, discovered in 1849 by Doctors Rebviani and Krapf, ascended by the travelers Otto Ehlers and Abbott? How were they able to establish their workshops there, erect a foundry, and bring a large number of help, or at least enough to succeed? How had they been able to establish friendly relations with the dangerous tribes of the country, and their sovereigns, as cunning as they were cruel? This we do not know. And perhaps it would never be known, as there were only a few days left before the 22nd of September would arrive. J.T. Maston heard from Mrs. Evangelina Scorbitt that the mystery of Kilimanjaro had been unveiled by a telegram sent from Zanzibar. "Great Scott!" he exclaimed, sawing the air with his iron hand. "Well, we do not travel by telegram yet, nor by telephone, and in 6 days the matter will be finished." Those who saw and heard this remarkable man utter these words were astonished at the energy in the old gunner. J.T. Maston was right. There was no time left to send agents to Wamasai with orders to arrest President Barbicane. They would even have been too late had they departed from Algiers or Egypt, even from Aden, Madagascar, or Zanzibar, as they would have met thousands of difficulties in this mountainous region, and perhaps they would have met with an army composed of followers of the Sultan, who was interested in the matter. Therefore all hope of preventing this operation had to be given up. But if prevention was impossible, nothing seemed more easy than the figuring out of the terrible consequences, as the exact situation of X was now known. This problem was difficult enough, but all algebraists and mathematicians of large reputation ought to be able to solve it. As the cable of the Council of Zanzibar had been sent direct to the Minister of State at Washington, the federal government wanted to keep it secret at first. They wished as well that its contents were published all over the country, so that they could indicate what the results would be of this displacement of the axis and the uprising of the oceans, and thus the inhabitants of the world might learn which place of refuge was open to them according to the section of the globe in which they lived. And it is easy to understand how anxious the people were to learn their fate. On the 14th of September, the cable dispatch was sent to the office of the observatory at Washington, with orders to figure out the final consequences upon geographical locations. 2 days afterwards, the problem was all worked out. The Old World was notified of the results by cable, and the New World by telegram. After this calculation had been published by thousands of papers, it was the only thing talked of in the great cities and everywhere. What will happen? This was the question which everybody was asking at every point of the globe. The following was the notice made by the observatory at Washington. Important notice. The operation which is being tried by President Barbicane and Captain Nicholl is as follows. The production of a recoil on the 22nd of September at midnight by means of a cannon 1,000,000 times larger in volume than the cannon of 27 centimeters, throwing a projectile of 180,000 tons with a powder giving it a velocity of 2,800 kilometers. Now, if this shooting takes place below the equatorial line, nearly on the 34th degree of latitude west of the meridian of Paris at the foot of Kilimanjaro, and if it is directed towards the south, these are the mechanical effects which it will have on the Earth's sphere. Instantly, in consequence of the shock acting with the daily movement, a new axis will be formed, and, As the old axis will be displaced to the amount of 23 degrees and 28 minutes, according to the figures obtained by J.T. Maston, the new axis will be perpendicular to the direction of the ecliptic. Which point will the new axis start from? As the point of shooting is known, it has been easy to calculate this. In the north, the extremity of the new axis will be situated between Greenland and Grinnelland, exactly on that part of Baffin's Sea where it cuts the Arctic polar circle. In the south, it will be on the line of the Antarctic Circle, a few degrees east of Adélie. Under these conditions, a new zero meridian starting from the new North Pole will pass through Dublin in Ireland, Paris in France, Palermo in Sicily, the Gulf of Grand Citra on the coast of Tripoli, Obed in Darfur, the mountain chain of Kilimanjaro, Madagascar, the Kerguelen Island in the Central Pacific, the new Antarctic Pole, the Antipodes of Paris, Cook Island, the island of Quadra, Vancouver, on the margin of British Columbia, across North America to Melville Island in the neighborhood of the North Pole. In connection with this new axis of rotation, starting from Baffin's Bay in the north to Adélie in the south, a new equator will be formed above which the sun will travel without ever changing its daily course. The equinoctial line will cross the Kilimanjaro at Wamasai, the Indian Ocean, Goa, and Chichakola, a little below Calcutta in India, Mandalay in the Kingdom of Siam, Kaishou in Tonquin, Hong Kong in China, Risa Island, Marshall Island, Gaspar Rico, Walker Island in the Pacific, the Cordilleras in the Argentine Republic, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, the islands of Trinity and St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, St. Paul de Londo on the Congo, and finally it will meet again in the territories of Wamasai back of Kilimanjaro. This new equator being thus determined by the creation of the new axis, it became possible to calculate the changes of the ocean tides, which was so important for the security of the inhabitants of the earth. It is just to observe that the directions of the North Pole Practical Association had taken measure to weaken the shock as much as possible. If the shooting had been towards the north, the consequences of it would have been much more disastrous for the more civilized parts of the earth. On the other hand, shooting towards the south, the consequences would only be felt most in parts less populated and less civilized. The careful calculations made showed how the waters would be distributed when thrown out of their beds by the flattening of the sphere around the new poles. The globe would be divided by two great circles, intersecting in a right angle at Kilimanjaro and at its antipodes in the equinoctial ocean. This would form 4 sections, 2 in the north and 2 in the south, separated by the lines upon which the ocean upheaval would be 0. In the northern hemisphere, the first section, west of Kilimanjaro, would take in Africa from the Congo to Egypt, Europe from Turkey to Greenland, America from English Columbia to Peru, and from Brazil as high as San Salvador, and finally the whole northern Atlantic Ocean and the largest part of the temperate Atlantic zone. The second section, east of Kilimanjaro, would include the greater part of Europe, from the Black Sea to Sweden, European and Asiatic Russia, Arabia, nearly the whole of India, Persia, Balochistan, Afghanistan, Turkestan, the Celestial Empire, Mongolia, Japan, Korea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the greater part of the Pacific Ocean, the territories of Alaska in North America, and also the polar region which belonged to the American Society, North Polar Practical Association. The southern hemisphere would embrace the third section east of Kilimanjaro, which would include Madagascar, the islands of Marion, Kerguelen, Maurice, Reunion, and all the islands of the Indian Ocean, the Antarctic Ocean, as far as the New Pole, half the island of Malacca, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, the islands of Sondi, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, New Caledonia, all the northern parts of the Pacific and its numerous archipelagos nearly up to the 160th meridian. The fourth section, west of Kilimanjaro, would comprise the southern part of Africa from the Congo to the Canal of Mozambique to the Cape of Good Hope, the southern Atlantic Ocean from Pernambuco and Lima, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, the Argentine Republic, Patagonia, the Fire Islands, the Malouine Islands, Sandwich and Shelter Islands, and the southern part of the Pacific Ocean east of the present 160th degree of latitude. These would be the 4 sections separated by the line of zero in calculating the sea level changes. Now the question was to indicate the effects produced on the surface of the 4 sections in consequence of the displacement of the oceans. Upon each of these sections there was a central point on which the effect would be at a maximum, either by the oceans rising up or the waters retiring entirely. The calculations of J.T. Maston had established without a doubt that at each of these maxima points the greatest height obtained would be 8,415 meters. It was therefore certain that the consequences would be most severe against the security of those points through the operation carried out by Barbicane and Co. The 2 effects may be considered separate in their action. In 2 of the sections situated opposite each other in the northern hemisphere and in the southern as well, the oceans would retreat and invade the 2 other sections, opposing each other in each of the 2 hemispheres. In the first section, the Atlantic Ocean would be nearly entirely emptied, and the maximum point of depression being nearly at the region of Bermuda, where the ground would appear, if the depth of the ocean was inferior at that point to 8,415 meters. Consequently, between Europe and America, vast territories would be discovered which the United States, England, France, Spain, and Portugal could claim according to the geographical situation, as these powers might wish to do. It must be observed that in consequence of the falling of the oceans, the air will also fall equally as much. Therefore, the barometric pressure of Europe and that of America will be modified to such an extent that cities situated even 20 or 30 degrees from the maxima points would only have the quantity of air which is now actually found in a height of 1 league in the atmosphere. The principal cities, such as New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Panama, Lisbon, Madrid, Paris, London, Edinburgh, Dublin, Cairo, Constantinople, Danzig, Stockholm, on one side, and the cities corresponding in latitude on the other side, would keep their normal position with regard to the general level of the air. In regard to Bermuda, air would be missing there the same as it would be wanting to aeronauts who go higher than 8,000 meters. Therefore, it would be impossible to live there. The same effect would obtain in the opposite section, which would contain the Indian Ocean, Australia, and part of the Pacific Ocean, which would be thrown partly on the southern sea-coasts of Australia. The air into which they would be thrown would be very clear. There was no doubt on that point. But it would not be dense enough for human wants. These in general were a part of the modifications which would take place in the 2 sections in which the oceans would be more or less emptied. There would undoubtedly appear new islands and mountains in such parts as the water did not entirely abandon. But if the diminution of the thickness of the air did not bring enough inconveniences to those parts of the new continents raised to the high zones of the atmosphere, what was to be the case of those parts which the eruption of waters put below the surface? We may still breathe under the diminished pressure of air below the atmospheric pressure. On the contrary, under a very few inches of water we cannot breathe at all, and this was the condition in which the other 2 sections found themselves. In the section northwest of Kilimanjaro, the maximum point would be at Yakutsk in Siberia. From this city submerged 8,415 meters under the water, less its present actual altitude, the liquid mass decreasing would extend to the neutral lines, drowning the greater part of Asiatic Russia and of India, of China, of Japan, and of America and Alaska to the Bering Sea. In regard to St. Petersburg and Moscow on one side, and Calcutta, Bangkok, Saigon, Peking, Hong Kong, and Yedo on the other side, these cities would disappear under a cover of water sufficient to drown all Russians, Hindus, Siamese, Cochin Chinese, and Japanese, if they did not have enough time to emigrate before the catastrophe. In the section southwest of Kilimanjaro, the disasters would be equally marked. This section is in the great part covered by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the level of which would raise 8,415 meters at the archipelagos of the Azores. All this vast area would disappear under this artificial deluge. Among others, the angle of southern Africa from Guinea and Kilimanjaro to the Cape of Good Hope, and the triangle of South America formed by Peru, central Brazil, Chile, and the Argentine Republic as far as Terra del Fuego and Cape Horn. The Patagonians, high as they are located, would not escape this immersion, and would not even have opportunity of taking refuge on that part of the Andes, as the highest points of that range would not be visible at all in this part of the globe. This, then, must be the result: the lowering of the upper and raising of the lower sections, and an entirely new surface to the oceans, produced by the coruscations in the surface of the earth's sphere. Such were the happenings which would result, and against which the people of this world had no help if they could not promptly stop Barbicane & Co. in their criminal attempt. End of chapter 15. Recording by Patty Cunningham.